I am Julian, 34 years old. After 12 agonizing years of sacrificing my youth, my personal relationships, and my sanity to drag my father's failing logistics company out of the absolute gutter and build it into a $75 million empire, my father stood up at a lavish family dinner, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Your brother will take over now." He actually smiled while he did it. My own father stood there in front of 50 guests, raising a crystal glass of expensive champagne, while my mother nodded in proud agreement. In that split second, a decade of my blood, sweat, and tears was casually handed over to a man who had never worked a hard day in his entire life. But there was one major detail my family completely overlooked in their arrogance. They had absolutely no idea about the ironclad legal documents I had quietly secured years prior. And right now, the very people who tried to publicly humiliate me and steal my legacy are facing the terrifying reality of losing everything they hold dear. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little succession plan, hit that like button if you believe in fighting back against toxic family members. And please, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything to me. Now, let us go back to the night that changed my life forever. The dining room of my parents' sprawling estate was suffocatingly warm. It was supposed to be a celebration of everything I had accomplished. We had just closed a massive regional distribution contract with a major retail giant, pushing Harper & Company's valuation past the $75 million mark for the first time in its history. I had personally negotiated that deal for 8 straight months. I lived out of cheap airport hotels. I survived on stale coffee and vending machine food. I missed my own birthday and skipped Thanksgiving dinner just to finalize the supply chain logistics. My father, Richard, had organized this extravagant dinner to supposedly honor the company's monumental success. The room was packed with extended family, wealthy neighbors from their exclusive HOA, and a few close business associates who loved to pretend they had a hand in our success. The scent of roasted lamb, garlic potatoes, and expensive red wine filled the air. The clinking of fine silver against porcelain plates created a steady, irritating rhythm. I sat near the head of the table, feeling a rare moment of genuine pride and exhaustion. I wore my best tailored suit. I thought this was the moment. I genuinely thought this was the night my father would finally acknowledge the man I had become, the man who saved his precious reputation. Then, Richard clinked his silver spoon against his champagne glass. The room fell entirely silent. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom Italian suit, radiating the kind of arrogant charm he always used to mask his deep insecurities and business incompetence. He talked about legacy. He talked about the importance of family bloodlines holding the reins of power. He went on and on about the Harper name and how a strong foundation requires a strong family presence at the absolute top. I smiled politely, assuming he was leading up to my official appointment as Chief Executive Officer. He turned his gaze toward my younger brother, Preston. Preston was sitting directly across from me, swirling his wine with a lazy, entitled smirk on his face. Preston was the golden child of the Harper family. He was 29 years old, perpetually tanned from midweek golf trips, and had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one disastrous vanity project to another. He wore a designer watch that cost more than a reliable used car, a watch my parents had bought him to celebrate his last failed business venture. My father placed a heavy, affectionate hand on Preston's shoulder. His voice boomed across the silent dining room, echoing off the high ceilings. And that is why, effective tomorrow morning, Preston will be stepping in to take over the daily operations as the new Chief Executive Officer of Harper & Company. Your brother will take over now, Julian. We are so incredibly proud of him, and I know he will lead us into a brilliant new era. The applause started almost immediately. It was the mindless clapping of wealthy relatives and sycophantic neighbors who knew absolutely nothing about how a logistics business actually functioned. I felt the air get sucked completely out of my lungs. The ground beneath my chair seemed to give way, dropping me into a dark, bottomless pit. My stomach twisted into tight, agonizing knots. 12 years of missing holidays, working through the night, battling creditors, and pouring every ounce of my soul into saving his company flashed before my eyes in a cruel, mocking montage. I looked down the long mahogany table at my mother, Sylvia. She sat at the opposite end, radiant in a silk dress. I desperately searched her eyes for any sign of shock, any sign of objection or maternal defense. Instead, she offered me a tight, placating smile. It was the exact kind of patronizing smile you give a dog when you tell it to sit and stay. She knew. She had known all along. She had probably helped pick out Preston's suit for this exact occasion. Preston caught my eye through the flickering candlelight of the centerpiece. His smirk deepened into a full, victorious grin. He did not look humbled by the responsibility. He looked triumphant. He had done absolutely nothing to earn this inheritance. Yet he was sitting there collecting my life's work like a shiny new toy. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up. I wanted to flip the heavy table, shattering every crystal glass in the room. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to expose how Richard had almost bankrupted us twice because he refused to read basic contracts. I wanted to tell the whole room that Preston was a fraud who was secretly drowning in debt. But I did not move a single muscle. I gripped the stem of my wine glass under the table until my knuckles turned stark white. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady and pushing the burning anger deep down into the pit of my stomach. You do not survive in high-stakes corporate logistics by throwing emotional tantrums. You survive by being colder, more calculated, and smarter than the person sitting across from you. I raised my glass high in the air. I plastered the most convincing, warm smile I could possibly muster across my face. To Preston, I said, my voice smooth, loud, and perfectly projected so every single person in the room could hear me. May you lead the company exactly where it truly deserves to go. The guests cheered even louder, completely oblivious to the venom laced in my words. My father beamed at me, clearly relieved that I was playing the role of the dutiful, obedient workhorse. They thought I was broken. They thought my spirit was crushed and I was just going to roll over, accept my demotion, and spend the rest of my life making Preston look good. The dinner dragged on for another agonizing 2 hours. I played my part flawlessly. I shook hands with the neighbors. I offered polite congratulations to my brother. I even gave Preston a firm handshake, looking him right in his smug eyes without blinking. The moment the valet brought my car around and I closed the heavy door behind me, the facade instantly dropped. I drove home in total, suffocating silence. The city lights blurred past my windshield as I gripped the steering wheel. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced in my 34 years of life. It was not just about a job title or a massive executive salary. It was about respect. It was the crushing, undeniable realization that to my parents, I was never truly a son. I was an employee. I was a disposable tool they used to generate immense wealth so they could fund their golden child's lavish, careless lifestyle. I pulled into the driveway of my quiet suburban home. I marched straight past my dark living room, ignoring the blinking light on my answering machine, and went directly into my home office. I locked the door behind me and turned on the heavy brass desk lamp. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I woke up my computer. I bypassed the standard company cloud servers entirely. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavily encrypted external hard drive. I plugged it in and typed in a 20-character password. I scrolled past years of detailed financial projections, commercial real estate deeds, and confidential employee records until I found a specific folder simply labeled Executive Safeguards. I clicked open a scanned PDF document. It was 70 pages long, filled with dense, impenetrable legal jargon that I knew backward and forward. I scrolled directly to page 42. There, staring back at me in stark black and white, were 3 signatures. Mine, my father's, and a state public notary's official seal. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the bright screen in the dark room. A cold, dangerous calm washed over my entire body. My father wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate thrones. He thought he held all the cards because his name was painted in silver letters on the side of the building. He was incredibly wrong. Tomorrow morning, he was going to learn the hardest, most devastating lesson of his life. To fully understand the magnitude of what I was preparing to do, you have to understand the absolute ashes I built this company from. You have to understand the 12 years of quiet suffering that led to this single breaking point. When I was 22 years old, freshly graduated from a top university with a business degree and a head full of ambitious plans, Harper & Company was a rapidly sinking ship. My father had run the regional logistics firm into the ground through sheer arrogance and a stubborn, complete refusal to adapt to modern technology. We had a fleet of outdated trucks constantly breaking down on the highway, a deeply demoralized workforce, and mounting debt that threatened to wipe out everything our family owned. I had concrete plans to go to a prestigious law school. I had my entire life mapped out. But my father came to me one evening, looking older, smaller, and more desperate than I had ever seen him. He sat at our kitchen table, put his head in his hands, and begged me to step in. He told me it was my absolute duty to the family. He said if I did not help him, they would lose the house, the cars, and their entire retirement savings. I canceled my law school applications the very next day. I packed away my pristine suits, rolled up my sleeves, and walked into a freezing warehouse that smelled intensely of diesel fuel, stale coffee, and impending financial doom. For the first 4 years, my life was a living nightmare. I worked 80-hour weeks consistently. I slept on a lumpy canvas cot in the back office, waking up at 3 in the morning to handle dispatch emergencies. I personally rode along with angry truck drivers to understand their route inefficiencies. I made the brutal decisions my father was too cowardly to make. I fired the dead weight he had kept around out of misguided loyalty. I fought tooth and nail to implement tracking software that dragged us kicking and screaming into the 21st century. I did not take a real salary for the first 3 years. Every single dime I managed to scrape together went straight back into saving the business. While my friends from college were buying their first homes, taking vacations to Europe, and contributing to their 401k accounts, I was aggressively fighting off aggressive creditors and begging local banks for 30-day grace periods. And where was Preston during all of this blood, sweat, and tears? Preston was living in a luxury condo downtown, entirely funded by my parents' dwindling savings. He was the charismatic dreamer, the artist, the visionary who was just waiting for his big break. Every 6 months, he had a brilliant new idea for a startup that was guaranteed to make millions and change the world. First, it was a premium dog-walking app that burned through $200,000 of seed money before it even launched. Then, it was a high-end cryptocurrency consulting firm that crashed spectacularly within a year, leaving behind a massive trail of angry investors and empty promises. Every single time Preston failed, my father was right there with the company checkbook to quietly clean up the mess. Richard would creatively siphon funds from our operating budget to bail Preston out of trouble. He even secretly leveraged some of our prime commercial real estate to secure a high-interest loan to cover a massive lawsuit Preston faced when one of his ridiculous ventures blatantly violated federal labor laws. I was the one who had to sit down with our frantic accountants and figure out how to hide the gaping, bleeding holes Richard was tearing in our balance sheets. I was the one who had to stand in the break room, look our hardworking warehouse managers in the eye, and tell them the company college fund matching program had to be suspended for the year, knowing full well the money had gone to pay off Preston's gambling debts and legal fees. Whenever I confronted my father about this blatant theft, he would wave me off with a dismissive hand. He would look at me with absolute condescension and say things like, "Family takes care of family, Julian. Your brother just needs to find his footing. You are strong. You have a head for numbers. You can handle the pressure. He is sensitive. He needs our support." I swallowed my burning resentment because I naively believed I was building an empire that would eventually be mine. I truly believed my backbreaking hard work, my late nights, and my unwavering loyalty were securing my future. I thought I was earning my place at the head of the table. But I was not stupid. By the time I turned 29, the blind, absolute loyalty to my father had begun to wear incredibly thin. I started seeing the harsh reality of my situation clearly. I was generating millions of dollars in revenue, expanding our operations across 3 new states, but my official title was still just Vice President of Operations. And my actual equity in the company I was bleeding for was exactly zero. The massive turning point happened 5 years ago, in the spring of 2019. We had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire our biggest regional competitor. It was a deal that would double our market share overnight and solidify Harper & Company as an untouchable industry leader. But we needed liquid capital fast, and traditional banks were completely hesitating because of the messy, erratic financial history my father had created by constantly bailing out Preston's disasters. I had been quietly and aggressively investing my own meager savings in the stock market over the years. I lived far below my means, driving an old sedan and living in a modest house, while I built a substantial personal portfolio. I sat down with Richard in his massive corner office and offered to personally inject $2 million in cold hard cash to secure the acquisition. My father was absolutely ecstatic. He jumped up, patted me hard on the back, and called me the brilliant savior of the company. But I did not hand over the cashier's check blindly. I placed a thick stack of legal documents on his desk, drafted by a ruthless, high-priced corporate lawyer I had hired quietly outside the city. The documents clearly stated that in exchange for my massive capital injection, I was to immediately receive a 35% ownership stake in the entire company. Richard barely glanced at the papers. He was so incredibly accustomed to me fixing his catastrophic problems, so used to treating me like an obedient, brainless servant, that he just flipped directly to the last page, grabbed his expensive fountain pen, and signed his name. He assumed it was just standard internal accounting paperwork. He never bothered to read the clauses. He never bothered to have his own corporate attorney review it. 2 years later, disaster struck our family business again. My father made a catastrophic error in executive judgment, signing a terrible, binding contract with a corrupt vendor that resulted in a massive, multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuit against us. The sheer size of the damages threatened to bankrupt Harper & Company permanently and seize all our assets. Once again, Richard came into my office, panicked, sweating, and absolutely desperate. Once again, I bailed him out. I ruthlessly liquidated my remaining personal real estate assets and secured a massive private loan under my own name to settle the devastating lawsuit quietly out of court before the press found out. And once again, I placed a legally binding document in front of him. This one transferred an additional 25% of his personal shares into my name strictly as collateral against the massive debt I took on. A very specific, undeniable clause in the contract stated that if the company did not repay my personal loan in full, with interest within 24 months, the shares would permanently and irreversibly default to my sole ownership. Richard signed it without reading a single word. He promised to pay me back from the upcoming quarter's profits. He shook my hand and called me a good son. He never paid me back. He completely forgot about the agreement the very moment the crisis was averted and the lawyers went away. He went right back to playing the wealthy, untouchable patriarch, buying expensive golf memberships, upgrading his luxury cars, and funding Preston's lavish lifestyle without a second thought. The 24-month deadline had officially expired exactly 1 year ago. The shares had legally and permanently vested in my name. The paperwork was filed with the state. The transfer was absolute. Sitting in my dark home office, looking at the glowing screen of my laptop, the math was incredibly, beautifully simple. 35% from the initial investment. 25% from the defaulted loan collateral. I owned 60% of Harper & Company. My father, the man who just publicly humiliated me and gave my job to his golden child, only owned 40%. He was a minority shareholder in a company that bore his own last name. And according to the ironclad corporate bylaws I had carefully structured and he had blindly signed, a minority shareholder had absolutely zero legal authority to appoint a chief executive officer, alter the executive board, or make any major structural changes without the explicit consent of the majority holder. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. The boiling anger that had been raging in my chest all night crystallized into something incredibly cold, sharp, and focused. I did not want a tearful apology anymore. I did not want their conditional love. I wanted them to feel exactly what it felt like to have the solid ground violently ripped out from under them. I wanted them to look into the abyss of losing everything they felt entitled to. I set my alarm for 5 in the morning. I laid out my best, sharpest suit. Tomorrow I was not going to work. I was going to war. I arrived at the corporate headquarters at exactly 6:30 the next morning. The sun was barely rising over the city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the expansive glass facade of the Harper & Company building. I walked through the empty, silent lobby, the sharp click of my leather shoes echoing loudly off the polished marble floors. I went straight to my corner office, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and began preparing the battlefield. I laid out the detailed financial ledgers, the certified shareholder agreements, and the bound corporate bylaws on my large desk like weapons in a carefully organized armory. I made sure every signature was highlighted, every clause clearly marked. By 8:30, the building started coming alive. The familiar, chaotic hum of the logistics floor buzzed steadily below me. But there was a distinctly different energy in the air today. A toxic, nervous, heavy energy. I unlocked my door and walked out to the executive break room to get a cup of black coffee. As I walked down the carpeted hallway, the usual morning chatter suddenly stopped dead. People looked quickly down at their phones, pretended to read files, or suddenly became very interested in the pattern of the floor tiles. No one said good morning. I saw Victor, our incredibly arrogant director of public relations, standing near the water cooler. When he saw me approaching, his eyes darted away nervously like a guilty child. He was holding a thick stack of freshly printed, glossy folders. I did not need to read the cover to know exactly what they were. They were the official press releases announcing my sudden departure to pursue other interests and Preston's glorious, triumphant ascension to CEO. Victor had always been a loyal, spineless lapdog to my father, prioritizing office politics over actual work. I poured my coffee, black and bitter, and walked right past Victor, looking him dead in the eye until he physically took a step back. I walked back to my office without saying a single word. Let them whisper. Let them print their little folders. At precisely 9 o'clock, my office door swung open forcefully without a knock. My father strode in, wearing a sharp, dark navy suit, looking every bit the conquering king surveying his kingdom. Preston trailed right behind him, holding a brand new, ridiculously expensive leather briefcase that looked like it had never held a single useful document in its entire existence. Preston was practically bouncing on his heels with barely contained excitement, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Julian," my father said, his voice loud, booming and authoritative. He did not ask to sit down. He stood directly over my desk, intentionally trying to dominate the physical space. "I assume you have begun organizing the handover materials. We have a massive amount of ground to cover today. Preston needs to be fully briefed on the new supply chain contracts by noon, and I want you to introduce him to the warehouse managers at 1. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, leaning back in my leather chair. I looked at Preston, who was trying his hardest to look stern and professional, but just ended up looking like a little boy playing dress-up in his father's oversized clothes. "I haven't organized anything, Richard," I said smoothly, my voice calm and steady. I intentionally used his first name. I saw a muscle in his jaw clench instantly. "Excuse me?" my father snapped, placing both hands flat on my desk. "We discussed this last night in front of the entire family. This transition is happening today. Do not make this difficult, Julian. Be a team player for once in your life and do what is best for the Harper name." "There is no transition," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am the CEO of this company. I have been running it for a decade, and I am not going anywhere." Preston scoffed loudly, dropping his pristine briefcase onto one of my guest chairs with a dramatic thud. "Oh, come on, Julian. Stop throwing a childish tantrum. Dad made the decision. You had a good run, but it's time for some fresh, dynamic vision. You're completely burnt out. Take a long vacation. Go to Europe. Take a generous severance package and get out of the way." The absolute, staggering audacity of this useless parasite telling me I was burnt out almost made me laugh out loud. Before I could respond and put him in his place, the office door opened again. I expected it to be Clara, my chief financial officer and my most trusted ally in the entire building. But it was not. It was Gregory. Gregory was our chief operating officer. He was a man in his late 50s who had been with the company since before I even graduated college. When I first started cleaning up my father's catastrophic messes, Gregory had been my mentor. He had taught me the intricate, exhausting details of long-haul route management. We had worked side by side in the absolute trenches for over a decade. When his wife got sick 3 years ago, I personally fought the insurance company to make sure her treatments were covered under our corporate plan. I trusted him implicitly. He was like an uncle to me. Gregory walked into the office and stood directly next to my father. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He refused to look at me. "Gregory," I said, narrowing my eyes, a sudden chill running down my spine. "What is going on here? Why are you in this meeting?" My father smiled, a wide, predatory, deeply satisfying grin. "Gregory and I had a very productive, early breakfast meeting this morning at the club. He agrees that a major change in leadership is exactly what Harper & Company needs to reach the next level of profitability." I stared at Gregory. The sheer weight of the betrayal hit me harder and faster than the humiliation at the dinner the night before. This was not petty family drama anymore. This was business. This was my inner circle, my trusted general, turning his weapons against me. "Is that true, Greg?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low, trying to contain the rage. "After everything we built together? After I kept this entire company afloat during the recession, so you wouldn't lose your pension and your house?" Gregory finally looked up. His face flushed red with a sickening mixture of guilt and overwhelming greed. "It's nothing personal, Julian. You have to understand." Richard presented a very compelling, aggressive growth strategy. Preston has some innovative ideas regarding tech integration. And as part of the corporate restructuring, I will be stepping up as executive vice president with a significant equity bonus. The puzzle pieces snapped together in an instant. A massive promotion, a huge salary bump, equity. My father had literally bought off my second-in-command to isolate me completely. He knew I had absolute, unyielding control over the daily operations, so he purchased the loyalty of the one single man who knew the internal systems almost as well as I did. "Innovative ideas?" I asked, mocking the corporate buzzword. I looked directly at Preston with pure disgust. "What innovative ideas? Another dog walking app? Or maybe we can pivot our 18-wheeler freight trucks into a mobile cryptocurrency mining farm. Tell me, Preston, do you even know the difference between a bill of lading and a freight invoice?" Preston's face turned bright red, his fists clenching at his sides. "Shut up, Julian. You are just a glorified, overworked dispatcher. You don't know how to scale a modern, disruptive business. I have high-level investors ready to back me the second I take the corner office. You have leeches ready to drain this company dry the second I stop guarding the vault." I shot back, standing up slowly from my desk. I leveled a furious, unblinking glare at my father. "You think you can just walk in here, buy off my loyal staff with company money, and hand the keys of a $75 million enterprise to a complete, documented failure?" Richard slammed his fist violently on my desk, rattling my coffee cup. "Do not speak to your brother that way, and do not speak to me that way. I built this company from the ground up. My name is on the front of this building. You work for me, Julian. You are officially immediately terminated. Pack your desk and get out of this building right now before I have corporate security drag you out by your collar in front of your entire staff." The room went completely, terrifyingly dead silent. Gregory looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Preston looked triumphant, crossing his arms over his chest. Richard stood tall, chest puffed out, breathing heavily, fully expecting me to crumble into a million pieces and walk away in shame. I looked at the three of them. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for 5 agonizing, deliberate seconds. Then I reached down, calmly straightened the cuffs of my crisp white shirt, and sat right back down in my leather chair, crossing my legs. "No," I said simply. Richard looked genuinely confused, his anger faltering for a fraction of a second. "No? Did you not hear me? I just fired you." "You can't fire me, Richard," I replied, pulling my keyboard toward me and waking up the screen, "because you do not have the legal authority to do so. Now, I have a very busy morning fixing the massive supply chain issues you created with that vendor last month. Get out of my office. All 3 of you." My father's face contorted with absolute, unhinged rage. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You have completely lost your mind. I am calling corporate security right now. You are trespassing." "Go ahead," I challenged, staring him down with absolute dead, emotionless eyes. "Call them. Make a massive public scene. Drag me out. Because if you try to forcefully remove me from this building, I will call my lawyers, and I will freeze every single operating account this company has before you even reach the lobby. The payroll will bounce tomorrow. The trucks will stop moving." Richard hesitated. His hand hovered over his phone. He saw something in my eyes he had never seen before. He saw a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose when it came to his toxic family. He saw a man who was ready to burn the building down with everyone inside it. He grabbed Preston roughly by the arm. "Fine. If you want to be humiliated publicly, we will do this the hard way. I am calling an emergency board of directors meeting for 3 o'clock this afternoon. We will hold a formal, recorded vote of no confidence. And when the board formally removes you, you will walk out of here with absolutely nothing." They stormed out of the office, Gregory following closely behind them. His head hung low like an obedient, cowardly stray dog. The heavy door slammed shut. The glass vibrated. I was alone again. The storm had officially made landfall, and I was standing right in the center of it. The next few hours were an absolute, exhausting masterclass in corporate psychological warfare. Even with my office door firmly closed and locked, I could physically feel the entire building shifting and fracturing around me. My father was moving fast. He was using his legacy status as the company founder to aggressively assert dominance. He was calling in every single favor from old friends on the board of directors. He was painting me as a stressed-out, dangerously unstable, power-hungry son who was trying to ruthlessly steal the family business from his aging, benevolent father and his helpless, visionary younger brother. At 11 o'clock, Clara slipped quietly into my office. She locked the door behind her, checked the hallway, and quickly closed the blinds. "It's an absolute bloodbath out there," Clara whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she dropped a thick, heavy stack of manila folders onto my desk. "Victor is already leaking anonymous rumors to industry blogs that you're suffering from a severe mental breakdown. Richard has been on the phone with the board members all morning. He is explicitly offering them increased quarterly dividend payouts if they vote to oust you at the 3 o'clock meeting." I flipped open the folders Clara had brought. They were the raw, undeniable financial data. Hard proof that every single profitable quarter for the last 8 years was directly, indisputably tied to my logistical strategies and cost-cutting measures. "Let him talk," I said, calmly organizing the papers into neat piles. "What about Marcus?" Marcus was our largest external shareholder. He owned 10% of the company and held a massive amount of sway over the smaller, quieter investors. He was an old-school, ruthless businessman who did not care about family drama. He only cared about the bottom line and his return on investment. "Marcus is entirely on the fence," Clara said nervously, pacing the floor. "Richard is pushing him incredibly hard, telling Marcus that Preston's connections in the tech world will double our valuation within 2 years. Marcus wants to see how the vote plays out. He wants to see who blinks first." "Thank you, Clara," I said softly, looking up at her. "Are you absolutely sure you are with me on this? If things go south today, Richard will ruthlessly purge anyone loyal to me. He will ruin your reputation in this industry. You could lose your job and your career. Clara stopped pacing. She stood up straight, crossing her arms defensively. I am the chief financial officer, Julian. I see the real numbers every single day. Preston will bankrupt us in 6 months. I would rather go down fighting with you, the man who actually built this place, than watch that arrogant idiot destroy this company. I am with you until the end. She slipped out of the office as quietly as she entered. I felt a small, powerful surge of gratitude. Not everyone had a price tag like Gregory. Just as I sat down to review the corporate bylaws one last meticulous time, my personal cell phone rang, vibrating violently against the wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Sylvia. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. A weak, pathetic part of me wanted to ignore it, but a darker, more masochistic part of me needed to hear exactly what she had to say. I hit accept and put the phone on speaker, leaning back in my chair. Julian. Her voice came through the speaker, soft, incredibly sweet, and laced with absolute, manipulative poison. Darling, I hear you are causing a terrible, embarrassing scene at the office today. Your father is very upset. I am defending my job, Mom, I said coldly, staring at the ceiling. I heard her sigh, the dramatic, suffering, theatrical sigh she always used to guilt-trip us when we were children. Julian, please. I am begging you, don't be selfish today. You are so smart. You have your own personal investments. You can go out and get a high-paying executive job anywhere in the country. You don't need this company. Your brother, Preston, needs this. He desperately needs a win. His confidence is completely shattered after that last business venture failed. He needs to feel important. He doesn't need a win, Mom. He needs a harsh reality check. You cannot hand him a highly complex, $75 million logistics company as a participation trophy just to make him feel better about being a failure. It's family property, Julian, she yelled, her sweet, maternal facade cracking instantly, revealing the viciousness underneath. It belongs to the family, not just you. Do you have any idea how hard it has been for me? Watching Preston struggle and suffer while you get all the praise and the massive salary? You have everything. You have a house. You have respect. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. I earned everything. I sacrificed my entire adult life for this company. I paid for his mistakes. And your brother deserves his inheritance now, she screamed, losing total control of her temper, her voice shrill and demanding. I told your father months ago that we needed to secure Preston's future before you completely took over and pushed him out. I told Richard to put Preston in charge, so the boy would finally have some respect in this city. You are ruining my family with your greed. The words hit me like a physical, devastating blow to the chest. I told your father. My father had not come up with this succession plan on his own. My mother had. She had orchestrated this entire, elaborate betrayal to protect her golden child. She had actively lobbied behind closed doors, whispering in my father's ear, to have me stripped of my life's work just to soothe Preston's fragile, pathetic ego. My mother was the architect of my execution. A chilling, profound emptiness settled deep in my chest. The last lingering thread of familial love snapped. Any lingering hesitation I had, any small sliver of guilt about destroying my family's reputation, vanished entirely in that moment. They were dead to me. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a hostile corporate takeover, and I was going to be absolutely merciless. Thank you for being honest, Mom, I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, affection, or humanity. It makes what I am about to do so much easier. Consider this my formal resignation from this family. Do not ever call this number again. I hung up the phone before she could scream another word and permanently blocked her number. I felt like I was attending a funeral for a mother who was still breathing. A sharp, frantic knock broke me out of my thoughts. Elena, my young legal assistant, peeked her head into the office. She looked terrified, clutching a heavy, fireproof document folder tightly to her chest. She was fresh out of law school, heavily in student debt, and she knew exactly how dangerously high the stakes were today. "Mr. Harper," Elena whispered, stepping inside and quickly locking the door behind her. "I got them from the safe deposit box at the bank downtown. The absolute originals. Just like you asked." She placed the heavy folder gently on my desk. I unzipped it. Inside, resting perfectly on top, was the original 2015 shareholder equity agreement, bearing the bright red stamp of the state notary. Beneath it was the 2019 loan default asset transfer document, also heavily stamped and certified. "Did anyone see you bring these into the building?" I asked, examining the seals. "No, sir," Elena said, her hands shaking slightly as she stood before my desk. "But Victor has been hovering around the executive suites all morning. He asked me where I was going. I lied and told him I was picking up lunch orders for the accounting department." "You did perfectly, Elena," I said, giving her a reassuring, solid look. "When the meeting starts at 3 o'clock, I need you standing right outside the heavy boardroom doors. Bring 10 copies of these exact documents. When I give you the signal, you walk in, lock the door behind you, and distribute them to every single board member. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Harper. I won't let you down." She left the room. I was alone again. I looked at the large clock on the wall. It was 2:15. 45 minutes until the board meeting. 45 minutes until my father tried to publicly humiliate me, strip me of my title, and hand my empire to a fraud. 45 minutes until I dropped a legal nuclear bomb on the entire room and watched the fallout. I stood up, walked over to the small mirror hanging on the back of my door, and meticulously straightened my tie. I looked at the man staring back at me. He was not a victim. He was not a sacrificial lamb for the Harper family. He was a survivor. I picked up the thick stack of financial reports and the fireproof folder containing my absolute, undeniable control over the empire. It was time to walk into the storm. The walk from my isolated corner office to the main executive boardroom felt like the longest, most grueling march of my entire life. It was a walk I had taken 1,000 times before over the last 12 years. Usually, I made that walk to discuss mundane quarterly projections, aggressively negotiate commercial real estate acquisitions, or completely overhaul our complex supply chain logistics. But today, the heavy, imported wool carpet beneath my expensive leather shoes felt drastically different. The air in the long, portrait-lined corridor was incredibly thick, practically vibrating with the kind of dark, nervous, unspoken tension that only truly exists right before a massive corporate execution. I held the thick, fireproof document folder tightly against my side, pressing it into my ribs so hard it actually hurt. Inside that unassuming black folder was my entire future, my 12 years of unimaginable, soul-crushing sacrifice, and the absolute, undeniable destruction of my father's fragile, unearned ego. I passed by the oil paintings of the past executives, men who had built the early foundations of the industry before my father almost ran it entirely into the ground. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the hall. I reached the doors. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I pushed them open with a firm, violent shove that made the brass handles rattle loudly, and I stepped into the room. The main boardroom of Harper & Company was specifically designed by my father to intimidate anyone who walked inside. It featured a sprawling, 30-foot custom mahogany table that cost significantly more than a standard suburban starter home. It was surrounded by 20 oversized, high-backed leather chairs that swallowed you whole. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, dizzying panoramic view of the downtown city skyline, serving as a constant, arrogant visual reminder of the immense wealth, power, and influence that supposedly flowed directly through this specific room. Every single seat at the massive table was filled. The full board of directors had assembled with terrifying speed. These were incredibly wealthy, highly connected men and women, many of them close personal friends of my father from his exclusive, overly expensive country club. They were people who had made their massive fortunes in commercial real estate, corporate law, and aggressive private equity firms. They were the kind of people who attended high society charity galas on the weekends and ruthlessly laid off hundreds of factory workers on Monday mornings. At the absolute head of the long table sat Richard. He had confidently claimed the chairman's seat, a position he legally held on paper, but one he had not effectively utilized or respected in nearly a decade. He was wearing his absolute favorite bespoke Italian suit, the one he saved for massive press conferences and high-stakes negotiations. His silver hair was perfectly styled, swept back without a single strand out of place. He looked exactly like a dignified statesman, a benevolent, loving patriarch guiding his vulnerable family business through a necessary, painful transition. It was a masterful disguise. Sitting immediately to his right was Preston. Preston had a brand new, ridiculously expensive leather legal pad placed neatly in front of him, a heavy gold fountain pen resting carefully on top of it. He looked exactly like a nervous high school student pretending to be a high-powered CEO for career day. He was trying desperately to project an aura of quiet, commanding confidence, but I could easily see the slight, rhythmic tremor in his hands and the bead of sweat forming at his temple. He was completely out of his depth, and he knew it, but his blinding greed pushed him forward anyway. Sitting directly to my father's left was Gregory, my former trusted mentor, the man who had disgustingly traded his integrity and our long friendship for a meaningless title promotion and a bump in his executive salary. Gregory entirely refused to look in my direction as I entered the room. He kept his eyes glued forcefully to the screen of his tablet, sweating slightly under the bright, harsh, recessed lighting. He looked like a man walking to the gallows of his own making. Down at the far end of the long table sat Marcus. Marcus was the absolute wild card in this entire orchestrated nightmare. As our largest external investor, he personally controlled a massive block of voting shares. He was a ruthless, incredibly sharp man who had built his own empire from absolutely nothing after growing up in severe poverty. He did not care about the Harper family legacy. He did not care about my father's country club connections or their shared golf handicaps. He only cared about profit margins, legal liability, and ruthless operational efficiency. Marcus met my gaze directly as I walked in, his expression completely unreadable, acting as a silent, terrifying judge waiting to see exactly how the gladiators would fight in the arena. I did not take my usual assigned seat near the head of the table. I refused to sit near them. Instead, I walked to the exact opposite end of the room, standing directly facing my father across 30 feet of polished wood. I placed my black fireproof folder gently on the table. I sat down, calmly buttoned my suit jacket, folded my hands together, and rested them on the wood. I did not say a single word. I just waited, staring right through my father. Richard cleared his throat loudly, a booming sound that instantly commanded the undivided attention of the entire room. He leaned forward gracefully, resting his elbows on the table, steepled his manicured fingers together, and put on his most solemn, deeply concerned facial expression. It was an absolutely masterful performance. If I did not know the absolute, undeniable monster hiding just beneath that expensive suit, I might have actually believed his lies. "Ladies and gentlemen of the esteemed board," Richard began, his voice dropping a full octave to sound incredibly grave and serious. "Thank you all for convening on such incredibly short notice. I know many of you had to cancel important meetings to be here. As you all well know, Harper & Company has reached an unprecedented, historic milestone this quarter. We are officially a $75 million enterprise. And while we absolutely must celebrate this incredible, hard-won success, it is our strict fiduciary duty to look past today and secure the long-term future of this institution." He paused dramatically, letting the heavy silence hang in the cold, air-conditioned room. He cast a deeply sorrowful, pitying look all the way down the table, aiming it directly at my face. "My eldest son, Julian, has served admirably as the operational head of this company for many grueling years. He has worked hard. He has put in the long hours. He has sacrificed. But as a loving father, and as the original founder of this company, I have watched with growing horror the immense, crushing, physical and mental toll this demanding position has taken on him. The daily stress of the national logistics industry is entirely unrelenting. It breaks even the strongest men. Recently, over the past few months, I have noticed severe, undeniable signs of deep executive burnout, chronic fatigue, and increasingly erratic decision-making that actively threatens the financial stability of absolutely everything we have built together. A low, collective murmur rippled through the large room. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their heavy leather chairs and cast nervous, sideways glances at me. Victor's poisonous public relations campaign had clearly worked exactly as intended. The false narrative was perfectly set in their minds. I was the unstable, dangerously overworked workhorse who needed to be humanely put out to pasture for his own good before I ruined the company. Julian desperately needs rest, Richard continued, his voice practically dripping with thick, fake paternal concern that made my stomach physically turn. He needs to step away from the daily grind, perhaps take an extended sabbatical in Europe, and focus entirely on his deteriorating personal health. We simply cannot allow his current, highly fragile emotional state to jeopardize our recent real estate acquisitions or our delicate relationships with our key national vendors. Therefore, for the absolute good of the company and more importantly, for the good of my own son, I am formally proposing a massive, immediate restructuring of our executive leadership team. Richard gestured grandly with his open hand toward Preston, who puffed out his chest, attempting to look like a brave, visionary leader stepping up to save the day. My youngest son, Preston, has spent the last entire decade independently building a formidable, highly lucrative network in the technology and venture capital sectors. He deeply understands the modern digital landscape. He understands aggressive, disruptive scaling. Preston has bravely agreed to step in immediately as the new chief executive officer to aggressively guide us into our next phase of explosive, international growth. Furthermore, to ensure a completely seamless transition of our complex ground operations, Gregory has agreed to accept a massive promotion to executive vice president, providing the steady, highly experienced hand we desperately need during this critical, vulnerable shift in power. Gregory nodded solemnly, staring intensely at his legal pad, still entirely refusing to look anywhere near my face. He was playing his cowardly part perfectly, the loyal, dedicated company man stepping up valiantly in a time of manufactured corporate crisis. I have already had our top corporate attorneys draft an incredibly generous, ironclad severance package for Julian, Richard said, sliding a thick, bright white envelope forcefully across the polished mahogany table. It includes a full year of his current executive salary, the immediate, unconditional vesting of all his corporate retirement accounts, and a substantial multimillion-dollar cash bonus for his past contributions. We are absolutely not abandoning him. We are family. We are simply relieving him of a heavy burden he is no longer mentally capable of carrying. Richard leaned back deeply in his oversized chair, folding his arms across his chest with a look of absolute, smug satisfaction. The trap was perfectly set. The false narrative was completely airtight. To the outside observer, to these wealthy board members, it looked exactly like a compassionate, necessary, loving corporate intervention orchestrated by a caring father to save a highly profitable company from an exhausted, failing executive. I am officially calling for an immediate board vote, Richard announced, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute, undeniable, chilling malice. A formal vote of no confidence in Julian Harper's mental and professional ability to continue as CEO, and a simultaneous, binding vote to instantly appoint Preston Harper as his permanent successor. Marcus, as our lead external shareholder, I would ask you to second the motion right now so we can proceed. The entire room held its collective breath. The air conditioning hummed loudly in the background. Everyone turned their heads slowly to look directly at Marcus. Marcus slowly, methodically took off his expensive reading glasses. He looked intensely at Richard, studying his face for a long moment. Then, he looked all the way down the long expanse of the table, his piercing eyes locking onto mine. He tapped his heavy metal pen rhythmically against his legal pad. Click, click, click. Before I formally second any motion that completely destabilizes the proven leadership of a highly profitable, perfectly functioning company, Marcus said, his voice sounding like heavy gravel grinding together, I want to hear directly from the man whose head is currently resting on the chopping block. Julian, your father has just publicly declared on the official record that you are mentally unfit to run this company, and that your brother, whose last well-documented business venture ended in a spectacular, highly publicized bankruptcy lawsuit, is the savior we supposedly need. What exactly do you have to say for yourself in defense of these severe allegations? The spotlight shifted instantly, blindingly to me. Richard scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. Preston let out a small, incredibly arrogant chuckle, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. They genuinely, truly believed I had absolutely nothing left in my arsenal. They thought I was going to break down and beg for my job. They thought I was going to scream or cry or throw a violent emotional tantrum that would perfectly validate their vicious claims of my supposed mental instability. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice even a fraction of a decibel. I took a very slow, very deep breath, drawing the cold air into my lungs, perfectly centering my racing heart. I looked around the large room, making deliberate, unblinking, terrifyingly intense eye contact with every single person sitting at that table who had just silently agreed to ruin my entire life for a slightly higher dividend payout. Then I smiled. It was not a warm, friendly smile. It was the cold, dead, terrifying smile of an apex predator that had just quietly locked the cage door from the inside, trapping the hunters inside with him. What do I have to say, Marcus? I asked, my voice incredibly calm, smooth as glass, and echoing with absolute, terrifying, undeniable authority. I say that this entire emergency meeting is a complete, utter, pathetic farce. I stood up slowly from my heavy leather chair, pushing it back so the legs scraped loudly against the carpet. My father just gave you all a very touching, very emotional, highly rehearsed speech about family legacy, about my supposed mental breakdown, and about his deep, loving, paternal concern for my personal well-being. It was a beautiful, masterful piece of absolute fiction. But we are not sitting in this room to write fiction. We are sitting here to run a $75 million logistics empire. And in this specific room, only the cold, hard facts matter. I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my personal cell phone. I unlocked it, opened my messages, and hit send on a single, pre-written, blank text message. The absolute fact is, I continued, projecting my voice so it commanded every single inch of the massive space. Richard Harper does not care about my physical or mental health. He only cares about aggressively funding his golden child's lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. The absolute fact is, Preston Harper does not have a tech network. He has a massive, terrifying trail of unpaid creditors, angry investors, and looming lawsuits. And the absolute most important fact of all. The heavy mahogany boardroom doors swung open violently behind me. Elena walked into the room. She was incredibly pale, visibly trembling with fear, but she moved with absolute, unwavering purpose. She was carrying a massive, incredibly heavy stack of thick, professionally bound legal folders. "Distribute them immediately, Elena," I commanded, my voice cracking through the room like a whip. Elena walked quickly around the massive mahogany table, placing a heavy, dense folder directly in front of every single board member. She placed one gently in front of Marcus. She placed one forcefully in front of a heavily sweating Gregory. And finally, she walked all the way up to the absolute head of the table and slammed one directly down in front of Richard, right on top of his pristine, untouched legal pad. "The most important fact of all," I said, walking slowly, deliberately down the entire length of the table, my eyes locked dead onto my father's face, "is that Richard Harper does not have the legal authority to call this board vote. He does not have the legal authority to fire me. And he certainly, absolutely does not have the legal authority to appoint a new chief executive officer." I stopped right next to Marcus's chair. I looked down at the seasoned investor. "Open the folder, Marcus," Read it out loud for the room. Marcus did not hesitate. He aggressively flipped open the heavy black cover of the dense legal folder. The entire boardroom was absolutely, terrifyingly silent, except for the loud rustling of thick, high-quality legal paper as the rest of the confused board members frantically followed suit, opening their own copies. "What is this absolute nonsense, Julian?" Richard demanded, his face suddenly flushing with deep, furious anger. He forcefully shoved the folder away from him as if it were highly contaminated with a deadly virus. "Are these more of your boring operational spreadsheets? Do you honestly think a colorful pie chart about diesel fuel efficiency is going to magically save your job today? You are embarrassing yourself and this family." "Security. Read the damn document, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy, threatening whisper that carried across the wood. "For the first time in your miserable, lazy, entitled life, actually read the legally binding contract before you blindly sign away your entire future." Marcus quickly adjusted his reading glasses, his sharp eyes scanning the complex first page with blinding speed. He was a man highly accustomed to digesting incredibly dense, intentionally confusing legal documents in mere seconds. I watched closely as his eyes widened slightly in genuine shock. I watched as his entire physical posture completely changed in an instant, shifting rapidly from a relaxed, bored observer to a highly alert man who suddenly realized he was sitting directly in the middle of a live minefield that was about to detonate. "This is a formal, certified shareholder equity transfer agreement," Marcus said aloud, his deep voice easily cutting through the rising tension in the room. He flipped aggressively to the next page, his index finger tracing the dense lines of legal text. Dated April 17, 2019. It clearly outlines a massive emergency capital injection of exactly $2 million, personally funded in full by Julian Harper. In direct exchange for this capital, 35% of all existing voting shares were unconditionally transferred from the personal holdings of Richard Harper directly to Julian Harper. A collective, highly audible gasp echoed loudly around the enclosed boardroom. Several board members dropped their pens. Gregory looked exactly like he was going to violently vomit all over his expensive shoes. He physically pushed his heavy leather chair violently back from the table, trying to put distance between himself and the documents. "That's a complete lie," Preston shouted at the top of his lungs, slamming his open hand furiously violently on the mahogany table. His carefully constructed, smug executive facade had completely and instantly shattered, replaced entirely by sheer, unadulterated panic. "That's a blatant forgery. He faked the signatures. Dad, tell them right now it's a forgery. Tell them to call the police. Turn immediately to page 4, Marcus," I instructed, ignoring my younger brother's hysterical, pathetic outburst entirely. Marcus flipped the thick page. "This document is a formal loan default asset transfer," he read, his voice growing significantly louder, carrying a distinct tone of absolute, stunned disbelief. "Dated November 3, 2021. It thoroughly details a massive personal loan taken out entirely by Julian Harper to quickly settle the devastating vendor breach of contract lawsuit. A massive lawsuit that Richard Harper personally initiated through gross negligence. The stated collateral for this private loan was an additional, separate 25% of Richard Harper's remaining personal shares. The specific penalty clause states that if the loan was not repaid in full, including interest, within exactly 24 months. Marcus stopped reading abruptly. He looked slowly up from the papers, turning his gaze directly at my father. Richard was now gripping the heavy edges of the mahogany table so incredibly tightly that his knuckles were stark white and shaking. Richard's face had completely drained of all human color. He looked exactly like an incredibly old man who was actively having a massive, fatal heart attack right in his chair. "The 24-month deadline expired exactly 1 year ago today," I stated loudly and clearly, letting the heavy words hang suspended in the cold air like an executioner's sharpened axe. "The loan was never repaid. Not a single solitary cent was ever transferred to my accounts. The legal default clause was automatically and permanently triggered. The final transfer documents have been legally filed, fully certified, heavily stamped by the state notary, and fully processed by the corporate registry. It is a matter of absolute, undeniable public record. Any lawyer in the city can verify it in 10 minutes. I walked slowly, deliberately to the absolute head of the long table, standing directly between my frozen father and my hyperventilating brother. I looked down at both of them with nothing but pure, unadulterated, blinding contempt. Let us do the basic elementary math right now, since neither of you seem mentally capable of doing it yourselves, I said, my voice echoing sharply off the heavy glass windows. 35% from the initial corporate buyout to save us from bankruptcy. 25% from the defaulted lawsuit collateral to save you from prison. I legally, indisputably own 60% of Harper & Company. 60%. I leaned heavily over the polished table, bracing both of my hands firmly on the wood, bringing my face mere inches from my father's wide, terrified, darting eyes. You only own 40%, Richard? I whispered harshly, loud enough for every single terrified board member to clearly hear. You are merely a minority shareholder in a company that happens to share your last name. You do not control this executive board. You do not control the future of this company. You absolutely do not control me. According to the strict corporate bylaws that you yourself blindly signed without reading, any major executive transition, including the termination of a CEO, requires a strict supermajority vote of 75%. A supermajority you will never, ever have as long as you live. The heavy silence in the massive room was absolutely deafening. It was the loud, violent sound of a $75 million corporate empire violently and permanently changing hands in real time. Preston jumped up violently from his chair, knocking it over backwards. His face was contorted in absolute, unhinged rage and terror. He looked exactly like a spoiled, vicious child who had just been told his favorite, most expensive toy was being permanently taken away and destroyed. You planned this from the start, Preston screamed, pointing a wildly trembling finger directly at my face, spittle flying from his lips. You set him up. You purposely stole our family inheritance. You stole my entire company. You greedy, manipulative, disgusting sociopath. This is my birthright. Mom said this was mine. Your inheritance? I laughed loudly, an incredibly harsh, humorless, terrifying sound that made several seasoned board members physically flinch in their seats. Your birthright? You arrogant, useless, pathetic parasite. I spent 12 agonizing years bleeding onto the floor for this company while you were out playing fake entrepreneur with daddy's stolen money. I entirely sacrificed my youth, my relationships, and my sanity to personally pay off your massive gambling debts and your failed app startups. You don't have a birthright. You have a massive, cancerous sense of entitlement entirely funded by my back-breaking hard work. I turned my intense attention immediately away from the screaming child and looked directly back at the father. Richard was completely broken. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch who had marched confidently into my office just a few short hours earlier was completely gone, evaporated into thin air. He slumped deeply in his large leather chair, looking incredibly old, incredibly small, and entirely, utterly defeated. He finally realized the monumental, catastrophic scale of his own blinding arrogance. He had literally handed me the complete keys to his entire kingdom simply because he was too lazy and too entitled to read the basic paperwork placed in front of him. Julian? Richard whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling violently, real tears actually forming in the deep corners of his aged eyes. Julian, please. You can't do this to me. I am your father. I raised you. This is our proud family legacy. We can work this out together. We can share the absolute power. I will immediately make you co-CEO with Preston. Just, please, son, don't take it all away from me. Don't leave me with nothing. You lost the absolute right to call yourself my father the exact second you conspired with my mother to stab me in the back at a dinner table. I replied, my voice completely dead, completely void of any shred of human mercy or forgiveness. You certainly didn't want to lovingly share power this morning when you aggressively marched into my private office and illegally fired me. You didn't care about my hard-earned legacy when you actively tried to publicly humiliate me and destroy my reputation in front of this entire board of directors. You dug this massive grave yourself, Richard. Now you get to lie in it forever. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothing my tie, and addressed the entire stunned room of executives. The illegal vote of no confidence is officially cancelled. The ridiculous appointment of Preston Harper is permanently cancelled. I am the sole chief executive officer, and I am the absolute majority owner of this enterprise. Any questions? Nobody moved a single muscle. I slowly turned my cold gaze to Gregory. The man was practically hyperventilating, staring blankly at his open folder in pure, unadulterated horror, clutching his chest. "Gregory," I said sharply, like a cracking whip. He violently jumped in his seat. "Your massive, unearned executive promotion is hereby permanently rescinded. In fact, your employment at Harper & Company is terminated. For cause? Effective immediately. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear out your desk, pack your personal items, and permanently surrender your building keycard. If you are still inside this building in exactly 11 minutes, I will have corporate security physically throw you onto the street, and I will personally have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Get out of my sight." Gregory opened his mouth to speak, to desperately beg for his job, to apologize for his betrayal. But he looked deeply into my eyes and saw absolutely nothing but a brick wall. He scrambled awkwardly out of his chair, dropping his expensive pen on the floor, and practically ran out of the boardroom in a blind panic, the heavy double doors slamming shut behind him. Then I turned my full, undivided attention back to Preston and Richard. I had one final, devastating, crushing blow to deliver to end this war once and for all. "As for the two of you," I said calmly, folding my arms tightly across my chest, "I am going to give you a choice, an incredibly generous, completely unwarranted choice, considering what you actively tried to do to me today." I looked directly at Preston. Option 1. Preston, you can stay. I will give you a full-time job in the basement mailroom. You will make a standard minimum hourly wage. You will report directly to the strict shift supervisor. You will physically earn your meager paycheck with actual sweat for the first time in your incredibly pathetic sheltered life. And you, Richard, can maintain your useless 40% minority share and sit quietly on the board, speaking only when spoken to, with absolutely zero voting power over company direction. Preston looked absolutely revolted, his face twisting in disgust. "I am absolutely not working in a disgusting mailroom. I have a master's degree in communications. I am an executive. Option 2, I continued loudly, cutting him off completely. "I will formally buy out your remaining 40% stake. But I will absolutely not buy it at the current $75 million market valuation. I will force a buyout at the exact valuation the company had 12 years ago, when you almost ran it into total bankruptcy before I stepped in and saved it. I will give you absolute pennies on the dollar. You will take the meager amount of money, you will immediately sign an ironclad, binding non-disclosure agreement, and you will never ever set foot in this building or my life ever again. If you choose option 2, you are no longer family." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "You have exactly 60 seconds to decide. Decide right now, or I will immediately initiate a hostile, aggressive corporate freeze-out, suspend all dividend payouts indefinitely, and drown you both in so much expensive corporate litigation that you will have to sell your precious estate and your cars just to pay the retainer for your lawyers. The clock is ticking." The suffocating silence that immediately followed my brutal ultimatum was incredibly heavy, thick with the undeniable, metallic smell of absolute, humiliating defeat. Preston looked frantically, desperately at my father, his eyes wide with terror, fully expecting him to pull some miraculous, hidden legal maneuver out of thin air. He expected Richard to fix it, just like he always fixed every single one of Preston's colossal, expensive mistakes in the past. But Richard just sat there, completely paralyzed, staring blankly down at the highly polished mahogany table. He knew deep in his bones that he was utterly, completely destroyed. He possessed no leverage. He possessed no power. He slowly, painfully raised his heavy head, looking at me not as a loving son, but as a ruthless, untouchable conqueror who had just methodically burned his entire village to the ground and salted the earth. "We will take the buyout," Richard whispered, his voice cracking horribly, sounding exactly like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. He sounded like a man standing at the podium of his own funeral. "Draft the legal papers. We surrender." Preston forcefully slammed both of his hands on the table, standing up in a blind, irrational fury. "Are you absolutely insane? Dad, you can't just give up like a coward. We can fight him. We can hire better, more aggressive lawyers. We can take this entire thing to court and sue him for fraud." "With what money, Preston?" Richard suddenly snapped, a sudden, explosive burst of exhausted, miserable anger breaking through his crushing despair. "He entirely controls the operating accounts. He controls the majority voting shares. He controls the lawyers. It is completely over. We lost everything." I didn't wait around for another single second to watch them argue amongst the ruins of their own greed. I turned my back completely on them, nodded respectfully to Marcus and the remaining stunned board members, and walked calmly out of the boardroom. The brutal war in the boardroom was officially won, but I knew the toxic, radioactive fallout was just beginning to spread. I knew my father's massive ego too well to believe he would just walk away quietly into the night without throwing a tantrum. He was a man deeply, pathologically obsessed with his public perception and his standing at the country club. If he couldn't legally defeat me in the boardroom with high-priced lawyers, he was absolutely going to try and completely destroy my professional reputation in the public eye. By the time I reached my corner office the very next morning, the first desperate, vicious counterattack had already launched. Victor, our slimy PR director, right before I had the immense, deeply satisfying pleasure of officially firing him and having security escort him out, had executed my father's final venomous order. He had maliciously leaked a carefully crafted, highly manipulated, completely false story to 3 major regional business publications and several prominent online blogs. The bold headlines were incredibly brutal. They painted a horrific picture of a ruthless, deeply greedy, corporate-obsessed son who had used underhanded, deceptive legal loopholes to ruthlessly steal a beloved family business from his aging, highly vulnerable father, and push his visionary, innocent younger brother out onto the cold street without a penny. The vicious articles heavily implied that my supposedly aggressive, unstable management style was rapidly alienating key, long-term clients, and that Harper & Company was heading straight for a massive, unrecoverable internal corporate crisis. Almost instantly, my office phone started ringing constantly. Nervous, skittish investors, confused, angry suppliers, and even our biggest, most important client, Mr. Henderson, aggressively demanded immediate face-to-face meetings to assure them the complex supply chain wouldn't collapse completely under my supposedly hostile and erratic leadership. My father was intentionally trying to burn the highly profitable company to the ground from the outside simply because he couldn't control the flames from the inside anymore. I didn't panic. I didn't sweat. I didn't hastily issue a defensive, weak, whining press release denying the ridiculous allegations. When you are fighting a filthy monster in the deep mud, you don't use a small towel to clean yourself. You use a high-pressure fire hose to blast them away. I calmly picked up my cell phone, dialed a private number, and called Nora. Nora was a brilliant, deeply cynical, highly respected investigative journalist for one of the most prominent, widely read financial newspapers in the entire country. We had met several years ago during a boring corporate charity event, and I had quietly, anonymously fed her incredibly accurate tips on some of our corrupt, law-breaking competitors over the years. She owed me a massive, career-making favor, and she absolutely lived for exposing the blatant corporate hypocrisy of wealthy, entitled men like my father. "You better tell me you have something incredibly good, Julian," Nora said the exact moment she answered the phone, typing rapidly in the background. "Because right now, the public narrative is that you're the real-life villain of a terrible, low-budget daytime soap opera. People are calling for an SEC investigation. I have the absolute truth, Nora. I said calmly, pulling up a massive, encrypted file on my computer. And I have the exact receipts, the banking records, and the internal emails to prove every single word of it. I'm sending you a secure, heavily encrypted file right now. You are going to want to completely clear your front page for tomorrow morning. I hit send. I gave Nora absolute, unfiltered, undeniable access to 12 agonizing years of Richard's completely hidden financial crimes. I gave her the detailed, meticulous ledgers showing exactly how he had illegally siphoned company funds, aggressively dodging corporate taxes to illegally pay for his personal country club memberships, his luxury sports cars, and his extravagant European vacations. But far more importantly, I gave her the absolute terrifying truth about Preston. This was the final, brutal, devastating twist that my mother had tried so desperately, so pathetically to hide when she begged me on the phone to step down and surrender my life. Preston wasn't just a mildly failed entrepreneur who had bad luck. Preston was actively drowning in a massive, terrifying amount of illegal debt. His last cryptocurrency venture hadn't just failed. He had borrowed heavily from some very dangerous, entirely unregulated private lenders, essentially loan sharks, to keep the absolute scam afloat. Preston didn't desperately want the CEO title because he had a brilliant vision for the company's future. He wanted the executive title because he desperately, urgently needed the absolute, unquestioned authority to authorize massive, unchecked wire transfers directly out of the company. His entire, pathetic plan was to illegally siphon millions of dollars out of Harper & Company's operational accounts to quickly pay off his highly dangerous creditors before they physically broke his legs or worse. If I had weakly stepped down to please my mother, Preston would have completely, irreversibly bankrupted the $75 million company in less than 6 months just to temporarily save his own pathetic skin. Nora didn't just publish a standard article. She dropped a massive, inescapable journalistic nuclear bomb on the entire city. The massive story broke exactly 48 hours later, plastered across the front page and dominating every single financial news cycle. The headline didn't mention a greedy son. It read in bold print, "Behind the Mirage: How a CEO saved his company from his father's decade of fraud and his brother's secret, dangerous debts." The incredibly detailed article meticulously outlined every single failed, illegal bailout, every stolen corporate dollar, and laid bare Preston's desperate, highly criminal motive for the hostile corporate takeover. It completely, totally vindicated me in the eyes of the public and the market. It painted me not as a thief, but as the sole, exhausted guardian who had bravely stood at the gates and protected the innocent employees, the hard-working investors, and the company's legacy from two absolute, blood-sucking parasites. The massive public backlash against my father and brother was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely devastating. The exclusive country club Richard loved so much, the place that defined his entire self-worth, quietly but firmly asked him to instantly resign his membership to avoid bringing the horrific scandal to their doorstep. Preston's remaining shady investors instantly dropped him, actively threatening him, and he was quickly forced to flee the state entirely, moving to a cheap, run-down apartment across the country to hide in absolute terror from his aggressive creditors. I sat comfortably in my quiet office, sipping my coffee, watching the breaking news alerts light up my computer screen one after another. I had utterly, completely destroyed them. I had taken their stolen money, their fake reputation, and their immense pride. I calmly picked up my favorite gold pen, signed the heavily discounted, incredibly cheap buyout papers, and officially, legally erased Richard and Preston Harper from Harper & Company forever. 6 long, incredibly productive months passed. The violent, chaotic storm that had aggressively threatened to tear my entire life and career apart had finally, completely dissipated, leaving behind a clear, incredibly bright, unclouded sky. Harper & Company underwent a massive, ruthless, and entirely necessary corporate purge. I didn't just officially fire Gregory and Victor. I aggressively cleared out every single toxic executive, lazy manager, and corrupt board member who had ever aligned themselves with my father's toxic, inefficient regime. I actively promoted entirely based on absolute merit, fierce loyalty, and undeniable competence, not bloodline or country club connections. I permanently elevated Clara to Chief Operating Officer, rewarding her unwavering loyalty when I was under fire, and I made Elena the official, highly paid head of our brand new internal legal department. Without my father constantly, secretly draining the operational accounts to fund Preston's endless, pathetic failures, and completely without the suffocating, heavy weight of his outdated, arrogant, fearful decisions holding us back, the logistics company didn't just merely survive the negative press. It absolutely exploded in growth. We aggressively secured 3 new massive national distribution contracts that my father had previously deemed too risky. We completely implemented the highly advanced, automated routing systems my father had stubbornly blocked for years because he didn't understand computers. Within exactly 6 months of taking absolute, unquestioned control of the board, our quarterly revenue reports came in. We officially crossed the $100 million valuation mark, shattering every single previous financial record in the company's long history. I had successfully built an untouchable, highly profitable empire, and for the absolute first time in my entire life, I didn't have to share a single ounce of the credit with a man who secretly despised me. Exactly 1 full year after that fateful, incredibly humiliating family dinner where they tried to ruin my life, my executive assistant walked into my office, looking slightly nervous, and told me I had an unexpected visitor waiting down in the main lobby. I didn't usually take unannounced meetings, but when she quietly told me the name, I paused my typing. It was Richard. I let him wait down there for exactly 30 agonizing minutes before I finally, casually allowed corporate security to bring him up the private elevator to my corner office. When the heavy oak doors finally opened, I barely recognized the broken man standing there. The incredibly arrogant, imposing, sharply dressed patriarch was completely, totally gone. He was wearing a cheap, off-the-rack gray suit that looked slightly too big for his shrinking frame. His once perfectly styled silver hair had thinned dramatically, turning stark white, and he walked with a slight, incredibly defeated stoop in his shoulders. He looked exactly like an incredibly tired, incredibly ordinary, completely broken old man. He didn't confidently stride directly to my desk like he used to. He stood nervously near the door, essentially waiting for explicit permission to approach. "Hello, Julian," Richard said, his voice incredibly quiet, raspy, lacking absolutely all of its former booming, terrifying authority. "Richard," I replied flatly, intentionally not offering him a seat. I leaned back deeply in my expensive leather chair, keeping the massive mahogany desk firmly between us like a physical shield. "I read the latest quarterly reports online," he said, gesturing vaguely with a trembling hand toward the large windows. $100 million. You actually did it. You took it so much further than I ever could have imagined in my wildest dreams." "I did," I said simply, offering absolutely no further elaboration. I felt absolutely nothing looking at him. No lingering anger, no bitter resentment, no desperate, pathetic desire for his paternal approval. Just a profound, incredibly cold, unshakable indifference. He swallowed hard, looking down at his cheap shoes. "Your mother, Sylvia, she officially filed for divorce 3 months ago. When the corporate money completely dried up, and the country club permanently revoked our membership, she decided she simply couldn't live with the extreme public embarrassment. She moved to a small condo in Florida. Preston won't even return my phone calls anymore. He entirely blames me for not fighting you harder in the boardroom that day. He says I ruined his life." He slowly looked back up at me, his aged eyes desperately pleading for some kind of emotional connection, begging for some tiny sliver of the incredibly loyal, foolish son who used to unconditionally bail him out of every single massive crisis. "I lost absolutely everything, Julian. My company, my wife, both of my sons, my entire reputation. I'm living alone in a tiny, rented apartment on the very edge of town. I just wanted to see you one last time. I wanted to tell you directly to your face that I was wrong. I was incredibly, horribly, devastatingly wrong about you. You were the only good thing I ever created." It was the exact, highly emotional apology I had spent 12 long, agonizing years starving for. It was the ultimate validation I had sacrificed my entire youth, my romantic relationships, and my mental sanity to finally achieve. And hearing those exact words right now, standing firmly at the absolute peak of the massive mountain I had climbed entirely alone, I realized how incredibly worthless and utterly meaningless that apology actually was. "You didn't come here today to apologize to me, Richard," I said, my voice incredibly gentle but absolutely unyielding, cutting right through his manipulation. "You came here because you are incredibly lonely, and you have finally, painfully realized that I was the only person in your entire, miserable life who ever truly cared about you without wanting your money. You deliberately chose the golden child. You actively chose the illusion of control and the comfort of your own ego. You made your bed. Now you have to sleep in it entirely alone." I stood up from my chair, clearly signaling that the meeting was permanently over. "I appreciate you acknowledging my undeniable success, but we absolutely do not have a relationship anymore. We are not a family. Harper & Company is entirely my legacy now. I sincerely wish you the best in your quiet retirement. But do not ever, under any circumstances, come back to this building again." Richard stared at me for a very long, highly emotional moment. He desperately searched my face for any sign of weakness, but he saw the absolute, terrifying finality in my cold eyes. He nodded slowly, a single pathetic tear escaping his eye and rolling down his wrinkled cheek. He turned around slowly and walked out the door, the heavy oak clicking shut firmly behind him forever. I walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. I looked down at the sprawling, incredibly busy city below, the endless streams of traffic, the towering skyscrapers brilliantly reflecting the late afternoon sun. I gently placed my hand against the cold glass. I remembered the incredibly naive 22-year-old kid who had willingly given up his lifelong dreams of attending law school just to sleep on a filthy cot in a freezing, diesel-smelling warehouse. I remembered the sheer exhaustion, the midnight panic attacks, the crushing, unbearable weight of trying to desperately earn the love of a toxic family that only ever saw me as a convenient ATM machine. I didn't cry. I smiled. A genuine, incredibly deep, profoundly peaceful smile. I had survived the ultimate, devastating betrayal. I had taken the absolute worst, most vicious attacks they could possibly throw at me, and I had used that intense fire to aggressively forge myself into something completely unbreakable. I didn't just save my father's failing company. I utterly conquered it. I aggressively took full, unconditional custody of my own life, my own future, and my own immense wealth. The greatest revenge in this world isn't screaming. It isn't physical violence. It isn't begging for an apology. The greatest, most satisfying revenge is absolute, undeniable, monumental success, and the total, unbothered, permanent removal of highly toxic people from your entire universe. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my long, complicated story. If there is one crucial thing I desperately want you to take away from this, it's this: never, ever let anyone, especially your own blood family, falsely convince you that your incredibly hard work is just an unpaid obligation. Never let them gaslight you into believing you deserve less while they greedily take more. Loyalty is a beautiful, rare thing, but blind loyalty to deeply toxic, abusive people is just a slow form of self-destruction. Set your absolute boundaries. Build your own massive empire. Protect your personal peace with absolutely everything you have, and never apologize for knowing your worth. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, painful line in the sand and walk completely away from the very people who were supposed to love and protect you? Share your own personal story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you absolutely don't miss the next incredible journey we share together. Until next time, stay incredibly strong, and always know your worth.